Welcome to the Venezuelanalysis podcast. I'm your host, José Luis Granados Ceja. The Venezuelanalysis podcast brings you independent, on-the-ground, English-language coverage of Venezuela and the Bolivarian process. You'll hear news and in-depth analysis about the country, as well as coverage of leftist and grassroots forces. And on today's program, we're going to be looking at the relationship between Latin America, more specifically Venezuela, but also Mexico, with Trump. Obviously, a lot has happened with the change in the White House, and so we thought we would take a deeper look to see what we can analyze given what's happened so far, but obviously also kind of picking up on everything that happened in Trump's first term. And a lot of things have actually happened in these early 2 weeks, so there's plenty to talk about, especially when it comes to Venezuela and Mexico. And to talk about this, we're actually doing a kind of special production here. For those of you who don't know, I also host a podcast on Mexico with Kurt Hackbarth, who's seated to my left here. He is a political analyst based here in Mexico, an excellent contributor to the Soberanía podcast, and also features on the new program that we have here in Mexico, Sin Muros. And from the Venezuelanalysis team, Cira Pascual Marquina, who, of course, is also a writer at the Venezuelanalysis website. I can't think of a better person to help us break down this relationship with Latin America and Trump. So I thought I would first begin. Kurt, why don't you introduce yourselves to our Venezuelanalysis viewers? They may not be familiar with you and your work.
Thanks very much, José Luis. Cira, a pleasure to be on the show. My name is Kurt Hackbarth. I'm a political analyst and also fiction writer. And I write for Jacobin magazine in the United States, and those articles are often translated into Jacobin Latin America. And with José Luis on the Soberanía podcast, and as well here on Canal 11 here in Mexico, our new program, Sin Muros, which we're very happy about and appreciate all the support we've gotten over there.
And Cira, please introduce yourself again to everybody who probably already knows you, but might as well go through with the emotions here.
Let's do it. So I'm Cira. I'm part of the team at Venezuelanalysis. I'm also a popular educator at El Panal Común, and I'm also the producer of a Marxist education program called Escuela de Cuadros, or Cadre School. So that's a little bit of what I am about. And it's really great to be here again, José Luis. Thank you. And nice to be here with Kurt.
All right, welcome everybody. So just to give people a bit of a rundown in terms of what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to do an assessment of the Trump policy in Latin America in general. What can we conclude thus far? We want to talk about something I think is quite curious about the whole Trump phenomenon, which is that he's clearly pursuing his mass deportation plans. It was a major campaign promise. Obviously, with everything we've seen thus far, this is a top priority for his government. But that kind of runs in contradiction in a way with his regime change efforts, particularly when it comes to places like Venezuela, but also Cuba, Nicaragua. And on the final segment, we're going to be talking about lessons from what we've seen thus far from Venezuela, from Mexico, when it comes to the Trump phenomenon, but also bringing in his first term. What happened in that first term? What can we expect? Or is it right to think about this being a different kind of relationship moving forward? So let's begin with an assessment of Trump policy in general. What can we conclude thus far? And I'll just start things off for us. There's a couple of major incidents, episodes that I think can set the scene for us. The first one being, of course, the situation around Panama. On the campaign trail, he was talking about the need to take back, quote unquote, the Panama Canal. Obviously, we know that there was a negotiation with the Carter administration in the previous century with the Torrijos government there, where they reached an agreement that eventually the Panama Canal, which was for a time considered sovereign U.S. territory, be returned to become sovereign Panamanian territory. And that's been the case since the conclusion of that agreement. But Trump started talking about how China had taken over and there were Chinese troops there. Of course, it's a lot of bluster. It's not really the case. In the case of Panama, what it seems like he's trying to maybe point to is the fact that one of the ports, the key ports that are on either end of the canal, it's a holding company that is a subsidiary of a Hong Kong company. Now, of course, this was granted in the late 90s. At the time, didn't really make much noise, even though by then they knew that Hong Kong would be handed back to China. But it wasn't a national security issue back then. Of course, now it is. And why? Well, I think a lot of it has to do with this rivalry, this global powers rivalry dynamic that's happening between China and the United States. So the United States seems to want to flex his muscle and be able to reassert a level of control over the canal, obviously at the cost of Panamanian sovereignty there. We saw Marco Rubio travel and reach a certain amount of agreements. So it looks like there probably won't be an invasion, but I wouldn't rule it out. Nonetheless, it tells us that, if he's talking about quite literally yet another, because it wouldn't be the first time, the U.S. invasion of Panama, it kind of tells you what he's thinking. There's also the situation that happened with Colombia. In Colombia, what we saw was these threats of tariffs. And we'll revisit that when we talk about Mexico, of course, where he said, Gustavo Petro, I'm going to impose these 25% tariffs because you dared to stand up for the dignity of the migrants who were being deported from the United States to Colombia in inhumane conditions on military planes, where with their ankles and handcuffs, totally locked up as if they were criminals when they are just merely migrants and asylum seekers. No need for that kind of treatment. Obviously, they reached a negotiation, but again, this episode, I think, tells us something about that. And then finally, today, what we saw this morning on the date of this recording, February 3rd, that after threatening, actually signing the executive order in the case of Mexico, Canada, and China of imposing 25% tariffs in the case of Mexico and Canada, 10% in the case of China, that he actually was willing to go through with this and impose this, with a varying amount of arguments being made. On the one hand, saying, these countries are not doing enough to control migration and fentanyl. On the other hand, talking about trade deficits and the need to attend to the issues around the bilateral relationship and commerce, et cetera, et cetera. And so he ended up backtracking. This morning, President Sheinbaum announced that the situation had developed differently, that there would not be an imposition of tariffs this month, possibly in a month. It's been paused for a month. But again, this incident tells us what kind of person, what kind of political actor we're dealing with here. And so I thought I would begin with you, Cira. Cira, tell us, these are just three very specific elements. We haven't even gotten to Venezuela yet. Maybe you could fill us in on that and the developments thus far when it comes to Trump 2 in the White House. What do you make of the White House strategy when it comes to Latin America generally and Venezuela specifically?
Well, so I think you did a good overall kind of like snapshot of the current situation. It is important to kind of like step back a little bit and think about what is the Trump project for the continent. First of all, actually, I think it's important to highlight that, of course, both the prior administration and this administration are imperialist administrations, that they basically are interventionist both, and they are going to be interventionist specifically in relation to Latin America, but there will be some differences, some specific differences. So, in principle, the Trump administration will call itself protectionist, right? And that will come along with the whole thing, the whole program of imposing tariffs north, south, east, and west, in principle to promote production in the U.S. Of course, we know that in this day and age, that those tariffs, tariffs, the most beautiful word for Trump, that those tariffs are actually also ways of generating or forcing policies that go beyond protectionist policies, of forcing, for instance, in the case specifically of Colombia, of in the end generating the conditions so that people of Colombian origin would be sent back to Colombia. So these policies have to be understood on those two channels, right? One of them is the supposedly protectionist channel. The other one is a coercion in terms of promoting the U.S. imperialist agenda. And I think that would be kind of like the general kind of like reading of the agenda. In the end, I want to highlight that in terms of Venezuela, for instance, both the prior Trump administration and the Biden administration were truly catastrophic. And now we are ready to face another catastrophic another catastrophic era with Trump too. And I think that around the continent, around Latin America, of course, we will see kind of like an expansion of the waves of the Trump 2 administration, because he's coming with more force towards our continent and in general towards the global south.
So Cira was talking about more force. Kurt, what do you make of the fact that we now have a Secretary of State, Marco Rubio? The first time we have a Spanish-speaking Secretary of State from the United States in a long time, but one that obviously has an inclination towards the right and even the far right, very linked to these, anti-Cuban groups, very much in favor of the hardline Venezuelan opposition. What do you think the effect of someone like Marco Rubio driving foreign policy of the United States means for Latin America?
Yeah, so I'd start kind of making a point that I've been saying over the last few weeks that, Trump wants to come back reloaded, and Trump 2.0 and all that. But, it's a different world even now than in Trump 1. It's a much more multipolar world, with the rise of China, as we know. And we've seen since Trump won to now the failure of coercive policies of the United States, right, in places like Ukraine and other places. So and obviously after Gaza, the soft power of the United States is in negative numbers. I mean, it's just really, nobody believed the United States before, but even fewer people believe the United States now. So Trump is not in as strong a position as he'd like to have us believe. And something stupid like trying to change the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America is symptomatic of that, right? It's something symbolic, it's dumb, it's flashy, but it really, it reflects more than anything else the decline of a world power. But really, there are people in Republican circles who believe that the United States should engage in a new expansionism, right? Because they think that the other powers in the world are expanding, so why not us, right? Which I've associated in other contexts to kind of a star that expands before it collapses at the end of its life cycle. So you see some of this kind of ridiculous adventurism with regards to Panama that you mentioned and Greenland. It's the race for resources, right? We know that in the Arctic Circle, 20% of the resources, the fossil fuels that have yet to be tapped, are up there. And with the thawing of the world, that's going to become the new, zone of combat. Right? So all of that as a general point. With regards to Rubio, well, we all know who Rubio is. Rubio is a fanatic. He's a fanatic from a fanatic family, right? And we've seen his record in the Senate with respect to that. That said, Marco Rubio in the last few weeks has been giving kind of an interesting kind of a cosplay of a responsible statesman, which kind of worries me a little bit because he's sounding actually almost to be the most responsible member of the cabinet of clowns of Trump, right? I mean, compared to Begsev and people like that, Rubio all of a sudden seems like the sane voice in the room. For example, I'm not saying he is. I'm saying this is the image he's projecting at the beginning of his period, right? Saying, for example, that he was opposed to invading Mexico without the consent of the Mexican government, something he said repeatedly. So he's actually said something to the effect of accepting a multipolar world, which, yeah. And of course, this mysterious sending of the envoy to Venezuela, which you two can explain to me, because I don't really understand it completely, right? But I'm sure that this topic will come up. So it's been a very strange, couple of weeks in the sense of trying to see somebody like Marco Rubio, who we know is a fanatic, trying to kind of cosplay as a responsible statesman, right? He's come out and said that he's not in favor of invading Mexico without the Mexican government's, sign on, which of course is not going to happen. And he's also, even made some kind of noises about accepting that, we're in a multipolar world now, right? Does that mean that Rubio has had a magical transformation to a different person, that the United States foreign policy is going to be different? Absolutely not, right? There's a continuity of imperialism across, the two-party system, and that's been in place for a long time. Does that mean that they're going to accept the new reality? I doubt it. you always have to kind of separate the kind of the pseudo-populist moves or the pseudo kind of, moves like, for example, Trump kind of brokering a ceasefire in Gaza and then, turning around and declaring that he's in favor of ethnically cleansing Gaza, right? So you always have to see what's kind of really behind what's going on there, and I'm sure we'll talk about that more in the next segment.
I want to pick up exactly on what you were talking about just now, Kurt, which is this continuity, and we should be clear about this. Thus far, a lot of the signs coming from the Trump White House is that they're going to keep the same policies that Trump pursued in his first term, that Biden continued in his government, and that now Trump, being in his second term, looks to continue. Why do I say that? Well, we saw very early on Marco Rubio in a phone call with Maria Corina Machado and her surrogate, Edmundo Gonzalez, where the U.S. labeled him the rightful president of Venezuela, which is kind of similar to the language that Biden was using, which is the legitimate president of Venezuela. And in fact, as we know now, there was an envoy that was sent from the Trump White House to Venezuela to have direct, open, not back channel talks. But even then, where there was a comment around that asking, well, does this mean that you're shifting your policy? No. We still recognize Edmundo as the rightful president, and the legitimate representatives are the one from the, at this point, 10-year-old National Assembly, 2015 National Assembly, who keeps self-extending their mandate, even though nobody except them think that they actually have any legitimacy, well, them in Washington, of course. And so, there are certainly these signs that we're seeing of a certain continuity between regime change efforts, between, well, how did it go? It was Democrat, Republican, Democrat, back to Republican, and it's the same, the bipartisan imperialist consensus on Venezuela. But here is, I think, the interesting development that we're seeing. I mentioned at the beginning of the program that Trump is dead set on carrying out his mass deportation policy. That part is, I think, very, very clear to everybody. A lot of the policies around Venezuela have actually revolved around this in particular. So what do I mean by that? Well, we saw the Department of Homeland Security revoked an extension given by former Secretary Mayorkas around the temporary protected status, TPS, as it's frequently called, which was afforded to Venezuelans, something like 600,000 of them in two different groups, first in 2021, then in 2023, allowing them to have work permits and live without fear of deportation while they're inside the United States. So those are now going to expire as they originally were meant to expire. In fact, there's some talk there about revoking them completely and so that they won't be able to move forward. And also there's the case of the parole. So parole is a different kind of system that the U.S. has to provide, not in the same way as TPS, but some kind of temporary protection. In this case, it was basically if somebody was able to have a sponsor who would be willing to shoulder the costs of bringing in somebody from Venezuela, well, they could stay. Looks like that might actually be canceled. Why? Because of that mass deportation policy that Trump is pursuing. He wants to say, look at all the 1 million Venezuelans I kicked out, recognizing the fact that many of the largest groups to arrive to the United States as of late have been precisely Venezuelans, but also Cubans, also Haitians, people from Central American countries. And so I think there's a contradiction here because he also, as we said, sent this envoy to negotiate a deal with Maduro. And that was actually appeared to be motivated by the fact that they want to have the ability to send Venezuelan migrants directly to Venezuela, something that is not actually afforded to them because of the strained relationship. So again, I'll start with you, Cira. Do you see here a contradiction, or do you see a way for these two issues, the regime change that they continue to say that they believe in, trying to oust the Maduro government, and these mass deportation policies? Do they run in conflict? Is there a way for them to coexist? Or do we think that this is going to lead to a breakthrough? Can we read this meeting that happened between Trump's envoy and Maduro in Miraflores as a breakthrough? Your thoughts, Cira?
Well, to a certain degree, the meeting that actually happened on Friday with Special Envoy Richard Grenell, that meeting is a recognition of what is the government, who is in charge in Venezuela, who's our president, Nicolás Maduro. So in that sense, there is a contradiction. And of course, the opposition, the fascist opposition in Venezuela is rather unhappy about this event. Now, the truth is that ultimately I think that it's a contradiction for us because we look at this from a humanitarian, from a, from the perspective of the people. But when you look at it if one sets itself in the position of imperialism, both policies are policies that are anti-human. Basically, the first question is, why are there hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans living in the United States? The reason why there are hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans living in the U.S. with TPS protection, some of them who went there with the parole system and others who went through other mechanisms, they are there, as I think is the case with 99.9% of migrants around the world. They've migrated from their country not because they actually don't want to stay in their country, but actually because the economic situation in the countries of origin are really, really dramatic. And this is particularly so in a country that has been under siege with hundreds and hundreds of unilateral coercive measures that have actually produced hundreds of thousands, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of deaths in Venezuela. So I think that when we look at the U.S. policy, it's of course a policy that's focused on the imperialist interests. And the truth is that when you look again at the Venezuelan case, all these people who have left, they are in the United States. If they come back to the United States, you could see to Venezuela, we could see problems on two layers. One in the United States. The United States needs a precarious working class. It's actually beneficial for the U.S. economy. But as people return to Venezuela, that's also going to have an impact on Venezuelan society. Because, again, this is a country where there's really not enough to go around because of the U.S. blockade, which is so cruel. So if people begin to come back to Venezuela, that's actually going to generate more internal pressure in Venezuela. That is true. So if we are actually looking at the objective of regime change, the contradiction may not be so huge when we really look into it, when you're putting the two policies side by side, right? So you have mass deportation, you have regime change policy, and you generate more and more and more and more and more pressure on the Venezuelan people, on the Venezuelan government by sending people back to Venezuela. So I think that those things have to be considered to really understand the Trump policy this time around in terms of the deportation of Venezuelans back to Venezuela. It hasn't happened yet. For now, what happened is that 6 basically mercenaries who had been caught here were returned to the United States, but we still haven't seen return of Venezuelans to Venezuela. I know that the government is going to work so that these Venezuelans come back in the best conditions possible, however.
Kurt, your thoughts on this situation, on this emphasis that the Trump administration is putting on mass deportation. We also saw that he appears to be negotiating, if not have already successfully negotiated, a so-called safe third country agreement with El Salvador, with the far-right president there, Nayib Bukele, in order to basically ship off all the ones that the United States can't deport directly. There's also this talk about expanding the existing facilities. We should be clear about this. It's not like he's going to create a migrant camp in Guantanamo Bay. It already exists. It was created and supported by various administrations, including Biden, in order to expand it and actually house migrants there. Apparently some Marines have already left and are starting to build it, even though that facility is under the State Department, not the Defense Department. But anyway, point is, so with these other elements here, Kurt, what do you make about how Trump's foreign policy towards Latin America will interact with his mass deportation plans?
Yeah, so I think that's the first point to make, José Luis, is the continuity of these efforts across parties, right? You've talked about that Guantanamo had migrants there going back before, Trump. We also see that, the policy of cuffing migrants goes back to Biden as well, and those flights were, going on long before, we saw what happened in Colombia recently. Right? Sad but true in that sense, right? With regards to the contradiction you've mentioned, we can see all these efforts by the Trump administration to try to get around that, right? What they'd love to do, the easiest thing for them to do is just to dump everybody across the border and have Mexico deal with it, right? That's what they want. Mexico has obviously resisted that role, although they have in the past accepted the migrant protection protocols, which is the stay and remain in Mexico policy, which means that people who are requesting asylum in the United States are sent back to Mexico to await their asylum appointments. And also, the Sheinbaum administration has allowed that. They have received migrants from other countries. Still, there is resistance from Mexico on that point. So you see these efforts by the Trump administration, for example, to negotiate the safe third country agreement with El Salvador, which means that the United States deems El Salvador to be a safe country where people can apply for asylum there. So great. So it means that how many thousands of migrants will wind up in Bukele's gulags, to get out when, if ever. Right? So that's a very worrisome thing, and this is a continuation of what Trump is trying to do. Trump 1 already had a number of safe third country deals in the works with Central American countries. Right, the El Salvador one is the most likely to happen. Right, but that was something that they were already trying to do from before. And so the idea then is, if they can't work something out with Venezuela, the Venezuelans will go to El Salvador. Mm-hmm. Right, and feed the Bukele prison industrial complex. Right? Cubans as well, right? Now, that said, anytime you have, a U.S. envoy having a direct and open meeting with the Venezuelan government, there's an opportunity there. There's an opportunity there for Maduro to get some concessions. Right, and it's a hit for the opposition in Venezuela, and that's why they don't like it. Even if it's a very cynical short-term maneuver by the Trump administration, it's still a degree of recognition of the legitimacy of the Maduro government. So these are things that you have to, in an imperial context, take advantage of in negotiations. Right? And this is why we're talking about in the other program, José Luis, that it's very important that Mexico not agree to accept, for example, Venezuelans, so that Venezuela has a chance to play that card and to, get the most they can out of those negotiations. And that's very important, right? But that won't stop Trump from trying to get around the contradiction that you've mentioned. And then there's this element of Trump that's just totally erratic, that has no logic to it whatsoever, and is just alienating natural allies. Right, alienating Canada, alienating Mexico. Trump was very offended Mexico's dignity over the weekend by saying that Mexico is, tied to the cartels in the most ridiculous way by sharing an article about Genaro Garcia Luna, who was the former security minister of the conservative government of Felipe Calderón, which the United States was in hock with. Garcia Luna was a big buddy of the United States back at the time. So that was very offensive for the Mexican government. Claudia Sheinbaum came out and strongly opposed that. We see him going after, Panama, which is, a right-wing ally, although Rubio was there recently. We see him, Colombia, which was for a long time the U.S. foothold in South America. Stoking Colombian nationalism along the way. So that's something the Latin American whole can hopefully take advantage of. The fact that Trump is, besides the contradictions you mentioned, is just being erratic and alienating natural allies, natural U.S. allies.
So we have a scenario thus far, but I do think that it's worth taking a look at the way things played out the first time around. When it case of Venezuela, obviously, we know that he took Obama's sanctions and turned it up to 11. Basically implementing what came to be known as the maximum pressure strategy. Mm-hmm. We saw it also with Cuba, and I think that's worth mentioning as well. Obviously, with Venezuela and Cuba representing, in a lot of ways, sort of the vanguard of the revolutionary projects in Latin America. This effort to strangle their economies, to do everything possible to harm the people of these countries in order for them to provoke them into launching into a regime change effort via coups, via insurrections, whatever you want. And so what does the Trump 1 experience tell us Is it right to even think that there's going to be kind of an echo of some of the policy decisions in Trump 1? I want to start with you, Cira. Do you think that we're walking into a scenario of what's come to be called Guaidó 2.0? And to remind everybody, Donald Trump, as part of his maximum pressure campaign, recognized a little-known lawmaker who declared himself president of Venezuela, thumbing his nose at the Venezuelan constitution in the middle of a plaza, saying, "I'm the rightful leader." Really, no basis for it whatsoever. But obviously, when the United States recognizes you, there are consequences to that. Obviously, we saw the fallout with the opposition taking control of a number of important assets and holdings, reserves that were very important and were missing when it came to Venezuela's response to the pandemic, for example. Now we have this whole noise around Edmundo González calling him the rightful president. Does the experience of Guaidó in the first term tell us that there could be a Guaidó 2.0 through Edmundo González backing via him the most extremist elements of the opposition, Maria Corina Machado? Cira, your thoughts?
Well, Guaidó, in the first iteration, is still standing as the formula by which the United States can not recognize the current government. So by all legal, from the U.S. perspective, by all legal paths, they have it covered with these, dictator abroad, that this dictator that they put for us abroad, he's not here anymore, as most people know, and he's not in Venezuela anymore, but he still fulfills the function. If there's a need in terms of the maximum pressure policy that never stopped against Venezuela, if there's some need for a signature, they can still turn to Guaidó. So right now it all seems like they are going to somewhat recognize Edmundo González as the rightful president or something like that. But they already have the other dictator who can sign whatever covered. That angle is covered. So I think that when we look at what may be coming from Venezuela and really for the continent, I think that we have to think about both as Kurt was saying, there's a sector of the Trump administration that really is warmongering sector. And we have to be aware of that. Can we expect more ratcheting up of sanctions in the next months? We don't know. There is there's a small opening in terms of sanctionings that happen with Biden. Will that be lifted or not? We do not know. But what we do know is that actually these people want to overthrow our government. For sure. And in fact, they don't just want to overthrow our government, they want to overthrow any progressive government in Latin America, as has become very evident. So I think that what we have to begin to think about is that the situation is not great, but we also have to recognize that in Latin America there's a bunch of progressive and left governments. I mean, of course, there's Mexico, there's Colombia, there's Cuba, there's Venezuela, there's Brazil, even though, Lula has been kind of wavering. There's Nicaragua and there's Honduras. So if we go country by country, it's not bad, the correlation of forces at the continental level. I think that what this situation with Trump calls for us Latin Americans, for us who are committed to the emancipation of people from the global south and from our countries, I think that we have to begin to work towards a reenactment of an integrational project for our continent. I think that that's really the only way to go about it. And it's not bad. I mean, it's really, if we look at now versus, 3 years ago, the situation is actually better. It would seem like it would have to be possible. Now, some people do not want to get together with, Daniel Ortega, and others don't want to get together with our president, Nicolás Maduro. Really, frankly, it's a question of life and death. We really have to promote integration in our continent. These countries, these governments have to come together. The enemy is huge. It's an enormous, violent, vicious enemy. And I think that that's really the only solution for the people of Latin America.
Kurt, I'd love to hear your thoughts on a regional response to Trump. You know, to remind everybody, after the Colombia incident, there was a call to host a meeting of CELAC, but unfortunately that ended up getting canceled precisely because it sounds like some groups, some countries decided to put a stop to it. Xiomara Castro, the Honduran president pro tempore of CELAC, said there was no consensus. And so that meeting was canceled. One of the things I've said is that, well, there should be a regional response anyway. If it doesn't have to happen necessarily in these forums, let's get together with those who are willing to get together. Kurt, what do you think the region needs to do in the face of Trump, given what they've seen from him in his first term and what they've seen from him thus far?
So I agree. There needs to be a much stronger regional response than there has been up to now. You know, in the first wave of the pink tide, there was some very noble attempts to unite, Latin America. UNASUR, MERCOSUR, ALBA. At that point, Mexico sat those out because it had, terrible right-wing governments. Now Mexico is, in a position to contribute to those efforts, and I don't think there's been quite enough there. López Obrador hosted a meeting of the CELAC in Mexico, got everybody to sit at the table, and even people who were, disputing across the table. That was the first step. Then there was going to be another meeting of CELAC towards the end of López Obrador's term that got postponed and then kind of conveniently forgotten about. And that didn't happen, the one that was going to happen in the Yucatan, right? There was also, we notice a difference in the discourse of López Obrador. Towards the middle of his term, López Obrador talked openly about a union of Latin America, in the Caribbean, and then kind of got some pressure from the U.S. and then started talking about a union of Latin America that included the United States, which would be a silly idea. That's just a silly idea. No fault to López Obrador there, but you could see that his discourse changed on that in response to some pressure. So that idea has kind of gotten shelved at a time when it's really clearly needed. I was very disappointed last week when the CELAC meeting was going to be convened and then dropped off. I think, consensus is always kind of a recipe for inertia in a lot of cases. Right, especially when you have the U.S. always trying to play divide and conquer on these things. That's why they're so active right now with getting Panama to say, look, we're pulling out of the Belt and Road initiative from China, and trying to reassert itself symbolically in the region, which it tried to do through the Lima Group throughout the tens. Now is the time. Now really is the time, and now that Mexico is in a position to really contribute to that. But we notice that, of course, there's going to be opposition, right? U.S.-stoked opposition. We know now, right, that the U.S. is basically turning Noboa's Ecuador into a protectorate, and they're just going to put a new base on the Galapagos Islands. We know that the United States is very active and Musk with Milei's Argentina. Right, and other conservative forces in the region, Peru now under the, usurper regime over there. So there's going to be a lot of resistance. There has to be a way to operate. If CELAC can't move forward, like you say, José Luis, on an ad hoc basis to get things, prime that pump. With regards to, Trump too, just to kind of end on that point, my participation on that point for this round. What's really interesting is if Trump's learned anything from his failed attempt to, invade Venezuela when was it, 2019? And that was led by John Bolton, the raving maniac John Bolton, who now Trump has sidelined. It's interesting that if Trump has learned anything, it's to not listen to John Bolton. I don't know if that's going to make his policy any better. I don't think so. But it is interesting that Trump seems to be taking a different approach. We'll see how that's going to play out in practice, because, of course, what they want to do is overthrow him. Nobody doubts that. I talked about Rubio kind of having this weirdly moderate tone at the beginning, the fact that Bolton has fallen out with Trump, But then, if you look at his cabinet, it's full of hawks and militarists in other areas. The question is to what extent I think Trump's obsession with deportations is going to crowd out his interest in regime change. I'm not saying that's good, but that maybe like his whole obsessive attempt to deport as many people as possible could kind of put regime change attempts at least on a back burner. He's supposedly making an overture to Iran, which has the Iran hawks furious. Again, with Trump, you always have to separate reality from rhetoric. So, I'm not necessarily optimistic. What I am trying to do is analyze the different, points as they arise.
So one final thing that I wanted to say with this is that, there's that old saying, which is like, don't get in the way of your enemy making a mistake. U.S. imperialism right now seems to be kind of, I call it feckless imperialism. It's sort of erratic. It doesn't seem to have a clear strategy. It's creating enemies out of allies and allies into enemies. It's just a mess. And I think that always is going to open up the possibility for us to exploit those. And I do think that this is the time. And there's a lot of things that have to happen that haven't happened. More regional unity. I think we all agree on that. But also, pushing the leftist and progressive governments of the region to continue to radicalize, to deepen their processes of transformation. We even places like Venezuela, we're seeing some encouraging signs of a pivot towards a social movement, more emphasis, a return to the protagonist, participatory models of democracy that were starting to emerge and then got interrupted by all of the actions of imperialism. Here in Mexico as well, having that room to breathe. Sure, the tariffs ultimately were paused for a month here in the case of Mexico, but I think the damage has been done, right? Can we really trust the U.S. anymore? Are they willing? What's the next time they're going to try something like this? It's time now to deepen the relationships with Latin America, to pursue other relationships with other parts of the world, not necessarily view always the United States. They will insist on treating this region as its backyard, and so we have to insist that we are not. And in order to do that, we have to have options, alternatives available to us, and that needs to be the emphasis. We've reached the end of the program. We'll give you an opportunity. We'll start with you, Kurt. Say goodbye and let us know where we can find you and your work.
Thanks very much, José Luis, Cira. Again, my name is Kurt Hackbarth. You can find my articles in Jacobin, the Soberanía podcast. We're on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcast. If you want to find out more about Mexico, in-depth analysis about Mexico in English. And of course, we're going to be on every Tuesday, Channel 11 and Mexico Canal 11, Sin Muros, to analyze more of the U.S.-Mexico relationship.
And Cira, any last words?
Yes, well, thank you again, José Luis, and to Kurt as well for the conversation. It's been a rich conversation, a learning conversation. Remember, everybody who's watching us, to go to Venezuelanalysis, our website. There you will actually find plenty of content covering, well, what is right now the Trump administration's policy in relation to the Venezuela, interviews and other content. And of course, if you can, do support us, because our work is work that is from the grassroots, professional work, but done from the perspective of the grassroots, of the people who struggle. And we do not have any corporate support. We just count on the people who listen to us and who read us online to go on doing the work that we do. So that would be my last words. But of course, actually, the last words should be going back to Chavez, who really left us a tremendously powerful roadmap in terms of Latin American unity. And I think that's actually urgent right now. So that would be where I would like to leave it.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to the latest episode of the Venezuelanalysis podcast. Of course, you can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, and other places. Be sure to give us a like, subscribe, leave us a comment, and share with your friends. We're making this effort to try to reach out to more people via this channel that is available to us on social media, on YouTube. So please, it really does help us out. Thanks again.